There are stories that begin with a crown, with power, with the kind of birthright that announces itself in golden light and the roar of 1,000 wolves lifting their voices to a full moon. This is not one of those stories. This story begins with a girl on her knees in the mud, scrubbing laundry that is not hers, wearing bruises that she did not earn, carrying a silence so practiced it had become indistinguishable from peace. This story begins with Mara Ashwood, who had spent 21 years being told, in every language available to a pack that had mastered cruelty the way others master song, that she was nothing. Not a wolf, not a shifter, not even a proper member of the Grey Fang pack, despite having been born within its borders, despite having breathed its mountain air since her very first breath, despite having bled for it in ways that no one counted or commemorated. She was the girl who could not shift, and in a world built entirely around the power of transformation, that made her less than a servant. It made her a warning, a cautionary tale told to pups who didn't eat their meals. You see what happens when the moon doesn't choose you. You end up like Mara, hands raw, back bent, eyes down. So keep your head low and be grateful you're not her. She had learned not to flinch when they said it. She had learned a great many things in 21 years of living at the margins of a world that had decided, before she was old enough to understand the verdict, that she did not belong. She had learned to wake before dawn, before the pack stirred and needed things from her. She had learned to eat standing up, quickly, the leftovers of meals she had prepared. She had learned to make herself small in rooms full of people who would not have noticed if she disappeared entirely, except that the laundry would pile up, and the fires would go unlit, and the children of ranking wolves would have no one to mind them while their parents attended the ceremonies that Mara was never invited to attend. She had learned, above all, to want very little. Desire was dangerous for someone in her position. It drew attention. It invited the kind of laughter that left marks that didn't show on skin, but lived somewhere deeper, in the place where a person's sense of their own worth was stored. Better to keep that place locked. Better to want only the things that could not be taken away. The cold clarity of mountain air before sunrise. The particular silence of the forest when the wind dropped. The feeling of a task completed well even when no one was watching. But there was one thing she had never been able to stop wanting. And it was the thing that shamed her most because of how impossible it was. She wanted to shift. Every single night of her life, she stood under the moon, and she felt something inside her that she had no name for. Something that pulled toward the light, like a plant, toward sun. Something that strained against the walls of her chest, as though it understood it was meant to be larger than the body containing it. Every single night, nothing happened. The other wolves transformed around her in cascades of silver light and joyful howling, and Mara stood in her human skin, unchanged, undeniable proof of the moon's disregard. The healers had examined her twice. The first time, when she was 7, and her parents had still been alive to worry. The verdict had been delivered with the particular brand of clinical gentleness that healers reserved for hopeless cases. Her wolf is dormant, perhaps permanently. There is no blockage we can identify, no curse, no injury to the spiritual channels. She simply does not shift. We recommend the family prepare her for a life of service. The second examination, ordered by the pack's beta when she was 15 and beginning to attract the kind of attention that unmated girls attract, had returned the same result with rather less gentleness and a good deal more impatience. There is nothing there. No wolf. No power. She is as human as a human. Move on. She had moved on. Or she had done the thing that looked like moving on from the outside, which is to say she had arranged her face into an expression of acceptance and continued to exist in the only way available to her. And for 21 years, it had been enough. It had been enough because it had to be. Because the alternative, the grief of truly wanting what you could never have, was a door she did not have the luxury of opening. So she kept it closed, and she worked, and she endured, and she told herself that a life, even a small and overlooked one, was still a life worth living. She told herself this often enough that most days she almost believed it. Then came the night of the great convergence, and everything she had told herself shattered like ice struck with a hammer, and the door she had kept locked for 21 years blew open all at once. If you've ever felt like you were living on the edges of a world that wasn't made, for you, I want you to stay with this story, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about belonging, about destiny, and about the kind of power that grows in the dark. Make sure you're subscribed and the bell is on, because we are just getting started. The Great Convergence happened once every century. That was the first thing to understand about it. Once every 100 years, the lunar cycles aligned in a configuration that the ancient astronomers of the Pack had, named the stacking of moons, where the full moon fell simultaneously with the lunar perigee, the midnight solstice, and what the old texts called the bleeding of the veil, the thinning of the boundary between the world of flesh and the world of spirit to its absolute minimum. On ordinary full moons, the connection between a wolf and their animal nature was heightened, strengthened, made vivid and immediate in a way that human words could barely capture. On the night of the Great Convergence, that connection became something else entirely. Not heightened, transformed. The old records described it as the night when masks fall away, and what remains is only truth. The night when what you truly are cannot be hidden any longer, when the soul shows itself without the permission of the body containing it. The Grey Fang Pack had been preparing for months. The elders had emerged from their usual near seclusion to oversee preparations that were part ceremony, part military exercise, and part something older than either. A ritual acknowledgement of a power so vast it made the Pack's own considerable strength feel like a candle held up to the sun. Decorations went up in the Great Hall. The best hunters brought in provisions enough for a 3-day feast. The Pack's strongest warriors ran perimeter patrols in rotating shifts, because the thinning of the veil meant not only that wolf power was amplified, but that other things, older things that usually kept a respectful distance from a Pack's territory, might find the boundary between their world and this one easier to cross. It was a night of celebration and a night of vigilance, held in the same breath, and the Grey Fang Pack was very good at both. What made this particular convergence exceptional, beyond its own ancient significance, was the arrival of the Alpha King. Cale Ashfield had ruled the 12 Packs for 11 years, since the death of his father in the war against the Northern Separatists, and in those 11 years he had become something that most members of the 12 Packs experienced only as a story, a force, a name that carried weight in every conversation it entered. He was 29 years old. He stood at 6 feet 4 inches of pure, relentless physical power, built by training and battle, and the specific, unforgiving discipline of a man who had understood from boyhood that weakness was not something he was permitted. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the combination was unsettling in a way that no one ever quite managed to articulate. The jaw suggesting iron, the eyes suggesting something that watched and measured and missed nothing. His wolf was legendary. Silver black, enormous even by the standards of alpha bloodlines, with a presence that other wolves described as walking into the eye of a storm that had chosen to remain still. His human form was not much different. He had the quality of contained force, of power that had chosen, for now, to be patient. It would not always choose that. He had come to the convergence because tradition demanded that the Alpha King witness the event in person at one of the 12 Packs' territories, rotating on a schedule established a century ago by his great-great-grandmother, who had been, by all accounts, a woman who left nothing to chance. This year's rotation fell to Grey Fang, so Cale had come, with a retinue of 40, his second and third, his personal guard, his advisor in matters of prophecy, and a woman named Elder Voss, who was the keeper of the ancient records and who had been watching the approach of this particular convergence with an expression that those who knew her found deeply alarming. She was not given to alarm. She was not given to visible emotion of any kind, generally. The fact that she had spent 3 months looking as though she was waiting for something terrible to land on her head was the kind of detail that, in retrospect, made perfect sense. Mara knew none of this when the morning of the convergence arrived. Or rather, she knew it the way she knew most things about the Pack's important events, as background information, the kind of knowledge you acquire when you are responsible for the preparations without being among those for whom you are preparing. She knew the Alpha King was coming because she had spent 4 days helping to clean the chambers where his retinue would sleep, carrying linens and beating rugs and polishing floors until she could see her own face. In the stone, a face that looked, she thought with the dry, private humor that had become one of her only luxuries, precisely as exhausted as it had every right to look. She knew the ceremony would happen at midnight in the great clearing at the center of the Pack's territory, the one the old ones called the Moon's Palm, because she was responsible for setting out the ceremonial torches and making sure the space was cleared of debris. She knew the feasting would begin at sunset because she was responsible for a significant portion of it, and her hands smelled permanently of roasted root vegetables and herb-crusted meat. She was not, it went without saying, expected to attend the ceremony itself. Servants did not attend. Non-shifters especially did not attend. The convergence was a moment of wolf power, wolf identity, wolf celebration, and Mara's presence would have been, at best, an awkward reminder of what the moon declined to bestow on everyone. The beta's mate, a woman named Sarah, who managed the Pack's domestic staff with the efficient coldness of someone who had never once needed to do the actual work herself, had made this explicitly clear to Mara 2 weeks ago. "You'll have the evening to yourself once the preparation is done. Stay in the servants' quarters. The last thing anyone needs is you wandering around looking lost during a sacred ceremony." She had said it with the particular tone that implied she was doing Mara a favor by sparing her the embarrassment of showing up where she wasn't wanted, and Mara had nodded and said "yes, ma'am," and thought nothing more about it. But as the sun set on the night of the Great Convergence, and the Pack began its ceremonial gathering, and the first drumbeats rose from the moon's palm, with a resonance that Mara could feel in her sternum, even from 3 buildings away, something happened to her, something she had no name for. The pull she had felt her whole life, the persistent, aching drag toward the moon that had never resulted in transformation, became suddenly, violently, incomprehensibly more. It was not a gentle intensification. It was not the familiar dull ache made brighter. It was as though something that had been sleeping inside her for 21 years woke without warning and announced itself with a sound she could feel but not hear. A vibration at a frequency below human hearing, in the marrow of her bones, and the space behind her eyes, and the center of her chest, where she kept the locked door. The locked door did not simply open. It came off its hinges. Mara was in the servants' quarters, sitting on the edge of her narrow cot, hands folded in her lap, listening to the distant drums and doing the practiced breathing exercise that she had developed over years to manage the particular ache of convergence nights, when her body became a stranger's. She felt it first as heat, a flush that moved from her core outward to her fingertips. So intense she looked at her hands expecting to find them visibly lit, glowing, burning. They looked the same as always. Roughened skin, calluses, the thin scar on her left thumb from a kitchen knife 6 years ago. But they were trembling. Not with cold, not with fear, with something for which she had no word, something that was its own category of experience, outside the vocabulary of anything she had ever felt before. The heat intensified. The vibration in her bones became almost audible. The pull toward the moon became so strong it was physically painful. A pressure in her chest, like hands pressing from the inside out, like something inside her had outgrown its container and needed to be larger. She stood up. She did not decide to stand. Her body made that decision. Her body was not asking her permission anymore. She walked out of the servants' quarters. She did not decide to walk. Her feet moved and she followed them, out the door and into the cold night air, across the stone courtyard, through the gate that should have been locked against non-participants, but whose keeper had apparently left it unlatched in the rush of ceremony preparations, and into the forest path that led to the moon's palm. She was aware of what she was doing. She was also aware that she could not stop. The two awarenesses existed simultaneously and without contradiction, the way dreams sometimes contain their own logic. She knew this was wrong. She knew the consequences. She walked anyway, because the thing waking up inside her was not interested in consequences and had not consulted her preferences, and she was no longer entirely sure where she ended and it began. The moon's palm was a clearing of perhaps 200 yards across, perfectly circular in a way that geographers had never satisfactorily explained, and the old ones attributed to the moon herself, who had pressed her palm to the earth here once, at the beginning of things, and left the impression. The forest surrounding it was ancient, old-growth trees, with trunks wider than 3 people standing arm in arm, and on the night of the convergence they were hung with lanterns whose light was deliberately kept dim, preserving the primacy of the moonlight that fell into the clearing like something solid, like milk made visible, like a gift from an enormous height. The entire pack was there, 200 wolves in their human forms, standing in concentric circles with the elders at the center, the warriors at the perimeter, the young ones with their families between. And at the center of the elders' circle, standing with a stillness that the air around him seemed to honor, was the Alpha King. Mara stopped at the edge of the tree line. The torches she had placed were burning exactly as they should. The clearing was beautiful. The pack was assembled and the ceremony had begun, the lead elder speaking in the ancient tongue that Mara had never been taught, but whose cadences she had heard all her life, rolling and complex and layered with harmonics that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. No one had seen her yet. She could turn around. She could go back. She could do the sensible thing and the safe thing, and the thing she had been doing for 21 years, which was to take up as little space as possible and want as little as possible, and be grateful for the smallness of what she had been allowed. The thing inside her chest laughed at this idea, not unkindly, but without any ambiguity whatsoever. The moon rose to its apex. The ancient words reached a crescendo. The lead elder raised her hands, and 200 wolves responded to the invitation, the shift moving through the crowd in a wave of silver and gold and amber light, hundreds of bodies making the ancient trade between forms, and the clearing filled with the beautiful chaos of it. Wolves of every size emerging from the light, shaking themselves, pressing against their families, the air thick with the primal joy of transformation successfully completed. It was, Mara thought, with the distant part of her that was still capable of thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and the most painful, in the way that beauty can be painful when it belongs entirely to everyone but you. And then the thing inside her said, not anymore. She did not feel herself walk forward into the clearing. She felt the heat become a blaze, the vibration become a roar, the pull become something so overwhelming it transcended physical sensation and became simply the truth of her body. And then she was in the light, the moonlight landing on her like a wave, and something inside her cracked open, not painfully, not like breaking, but like a seed splits, when what's inside it has finally grown large enough to insist on being recognized. And she was transforming. She was actually transforming for the first time in 21 years. And the transformation was not a wolf. The light that came out of Mara Ashwood was white. Not silver, not gold, not amber, not the spectrum of wolf colors that the pack had trained its eyes to read. White, absolute and total. A light that seemed to have an inside and an outside simultaneously. And those nearest to her stumbled back not from threat, but from instinct, the deep animal instinct of creatures encountering something beyond their category of experience. She was aware of her body changing, but not of pain. She was aware of height, of lightness, of a vast expansion of her senses in every direction that made her previous human perception feel like looking through a pinhole at the sky. She was aware of wings. The understanding arrived with perfect clarity. She had always had wings. They had simply been waiting for a night powerful enough to remember them. She was a raven, white as the first snow, white as bone, white as the space between stars. She was enormous, far larger than any natural raven, with a wingspan that stretched, when she extended them fully in the sudden shocked silence of the clearing, to 12 feet of white feathers that caught the moonlight and gave it back transformed. Richer, more layered, as though the light was better for having passed through her. She stood in the moon's palm among 200 stunned wolves and one alpha king. And for a moment, she was simply present, fully, completely, perhaps for the first time in her life, in a way that made all 21 years of smallness feel like preparation rather than punishment. Then the alpha king drew his sword. The sound of the blade clearing its scabbard was soft but absolute in the silence of the clearing, and those nearest to him stepped back, recognizing the quality of the motion, the absence of hesitation in it. Kyle Ashvale's face in that moment was not cruel and not calm. It was the face of a man executing a decision made long before this moment, a decision he had been prepared to make since childhood, a decision written into him by 100 recitations of the ancient text that every alpha heir was required to memorize in full before they were considered ready to rule. The white raven is the harbinger. When it rises, the packs fall. One who carries the mark of the raven carries the weapon of destruction. The Alpha King's duty is clear. He had been taught this the way he had been taught to breathe. It was not policy. It was gravity. He walked toward her. 200 wolves parted before him. The white raven held her ground with a steadiness that afterward people would describe in different ways, some calling it fearlessness, some calling it ignorance, and a very few, the ones who had looked most carefully, calling it recognition, as though she had been waiting for him, as though she knew what was coming and had decided, perhaps for the first time in 21 years, to stand in it rather than step aside. He raised the sword. He was 3 feet from her. The moonlight caught the blade and scattered, and the soul bond hit them both like lightning. Oh, I need you to stay with me right here, because this is the moment everything changes. And if you've been waiting to hit that subscribe button, right now is the perfect time, because what comes after this moment will absolutely leave you breathless. The soul bond was not a myth. Every wolf knew it existed, the same way every wolf knew the moon existed, as a fact so fundamental it didn't require proof. But in the way of fundamental facts, most wolves experienced it only as a concept, something they understood intellectually while privately assuming it would never happen to them. Soul bonds were extraordinary, perhaps one per generation among all the 12 packs combined, not because the capacity for them was rare, but because the conditions that activated them were so specific, so demanding, that most people simply never encountered the other person to whom their soul was anchored. The bond didn't choose based on social compatibility, or shared values, or even romantic history. It chose based on something older than choice, a complementarity at the level of spirit, 2 shapes that were made to fit together in a way that the soul recognizes before the mind does, before the body does, before any conscious part of the person has a chance to weigh in. When it activated, the experience was reportedly unmistakable, not pleasant, necessarily, not comfortable, unmistakable. For Kale, it arrived as a door opening in his chest that he had not known was there. He had spent 29 years being complete, or believing himself complete, the way that a person who has never heard music believes silence to be the natural state of the world. In the fraction of a second between raising the sword and the bond's activation, he was the Alpha King, duty-bound, historically literate, performing an act that every authority he respected had told him was necessary. In the fraction of a second after, he was something he had no category for, a person with an open door in his chest through which something vast and warm and irreversible had just walked. And the sword was still in his hand, but his arm had stopped moving, and he was looking at the white raven with an expression that he would never in his life be able to fully reconstruct or describe. But that elder Voss, watching from the elder's circle with eyes that were taking in everything and dismissing nothing, would later write down as recognition. For Mara, inside the raven, it was different. She had spent 21 years, being incomplete and knowing it, though she had called it something else, called it deficiency, called it the moon's rejection, called it her own inadequacy. She had never considered the possibility that what she had experienced as a wound was actually a waiting, a space maintained deliberately for something that had not yet arrived. The soul bond arrived now, and filled that space so precisely and completely that she understood, in a flash of comprehension that had nothing to do with thought, that the space had always been exactly the right shape. She understood this, and she understood also who it connected her to, and she looked at the sword that was no longer descending, and at the face of the man holding it, and she thought, with the exhausted, clear-eyed pragmatism of a girl who had survived 21 years of being everyone's last consideration, of course it's him. Of course it is. The sword lowered. Not fully, not all the way to the ground, but enough. Enough that the declaration it had made was rescinded, at least temporarily, and in its place was something that no one in the moon's palm that night, including its principal actors, knew how to categorize. Elder Voss stepped forward from the elders' circle. She was 73 years old, and she moved like someone who had decided that the appearance of age was optional and had chosen to opt out of it largely, her spine straight, her white hair unbound for the ceremony, her eyes fixed on Mara with an expression that no one who knew her had ever seen on her face before. It was not quite awe. It was more like the face of a person who had spent decades solving an equation and had just, unexpectedly, seen the answer. "Lower your sword, Alpha King," she said. Her voice was not loud and did not need to be. Elder Voss, his voice was completely controlled. This was impressive, given that he was experiencing something he had no words for, and that every instinct he had been given was currently in open conflict with itself. "You know what the text says." "I know several things the text says," Elder Voss replied, "including the parts that were deliberately left out of the version you were taught. Lower your sword, Kale. The bond has formed. You know what that means." He did know what it meant. He knew it the way you know the temperature has changed, without having to look at any instrument, through the body, through the bones, through the space in his chest that was now occupied by something warm and persistent and unignorable. You did not raise a sword to your bonded soul. Even the version of the prophecy he had been taught, the one apparently missing several critical sections, was unambiguous about that. You simply did not. It was not cruelty, and it was not weakness that stayed his hand. It was the oldest law, older than pack law, older than the 12 packs themselves, older perhaps than the institution of Alpha Kings, a law that lived in the wolf soul and could not be overridden by policy, or even by prophecy, however long its reach. The sword went back into the scabbard. In the sudden release of collective tension, the clearing exhaled. 200 wolves who had been holding themselves very still began to move again. Slowly, with the careful decompression of creatures whose system has been flooded with adrenaline and is only now being given permission to stand down. The white raven did not move. Mara, inside the raven, was performing a rapid inventory of her situation, with the ruthlessly practical part of her mind that had kept her alive for 21 years, and the inventory was producing results that were alarming enough to require careful processing. She had shifted. After 21 years, she had shifted, and what she had become was the creature the Alpha King had been prepared from childhood to kill, and the creature's existence was connected, by a bond she had not asked for and could not undo, to the Alpha King himself, the same Alpha King who was now standing 10 feet from her with his sword sheathed and an expression on his face that she could not read from this altitude, and through these eyes, which were extraordinary, she could see in approximately 17 directions at once, and the acuity was breathtaking, but human expression was still settling into her new field of vision. She shifted back. This also happened without her full conscious direction, the raven releasing its hold on her as naturally as sleep releases the body at morning, and she was Mara again, human-shaped and standing in the moon's palm in the dress she had worn to set out the ceremonial torches, a dress that was perfectly serviceable for torch placement, and considerably less appropriate for standing before the Alpha King and 200 wolves who were all currently staring at her, with expressions ranging from shock to terror, to the particular brand of reverent unease that humans experience in the presence of something they recognize as beyond their understanding. She was aware that she should feel afraid. She took an internal census of her emotional state and found, to her own bewilderment, that she did not. She felt awake. She felt, for the first time in 21 years, entirely awake, as though everything before this moment had been happening behind glass, and now the glass was gone. She felt the soul bond humming in her chest, like a plucked string that had been waiting for the right tension to produce its note. She felt the eyes of the Alpha King on her, direct and unrelenting and containing something that she did not have enough information to interpret, though she noted, with the cataloging reflex of someone who has survived by paying attention to things others overlooked, that it was not disgust, and it was not contempt. It was something he was working very hard to contain, and it was not small. Beta Cain, the Grey Fangs Beta, a broad man in his 40s with a soldier's posture and a bureaucrat's face, moved to stand between Mara and the Alpha King, with the resolute air of someone who had decided that physical placement could address a problem that was fundamentally beyond physical solutions. "Alpha King," he said, "this individual is a member of our domestic staff. She was explicitly told not to attend the convergence ceremony. I apologize for the disruption. We will remove her immediately and deal with the situation appropriately." "No," said the Alpha King. Beta Cain blinked. "I beg your pardon? You will not remove her." Kyle's voice had not changed in volume, or, apparently, in emotion. It had changed in something else, something that everyone in the clearing felt in their spines before they processed it mentally. Authority was a quality that lived in sound in a particular way when its speaker was entirely serious, and Kale was entirely serious. "She will not be touched. She will be given appropriate quarters. And Elder Voss and I and this woman will speak privately. Tonight. Now." "Everything else waits." Beta Cain looked at the Alpha King. He looked at Mara. He looked at the white feather that had drifted from her transformation and lay on the moonlit grass between them like a punctuation mark. He was a man whose entire professional identity was built on navigating pack politics successfully, and he recognized, in the way of such men, when a situation had moved entirely beyond the jurisdiction of pack politics and into something older and less negotiable. "Of course, Alpha King," he said, and stepped aside. Kale Ashvale looked at Mara Ashwood across the moonlit clearing, and Mara Ashwood looked back at Kale Ashvale, and neither of them looked away, and in the silence before either of them spoke, there was a whole conversation happening in a language that had no words, only the pull of the bond and the weight of 21 years of waiting on one side and 11 years of armored competence on the other. Two people encountering each other in the ruins of their respective certainties, both of them too old, in different ways, to pretend they didn't know what had just happened. "Your name," he said, not a demand, almost a question, as though he was asking for confirmation of something he had already somehow intuited. "Mara," she said, and after a moment, because she had spent 21 years being told her last name didn't count because she had no wolf, "Mara Ashwood." He repeated it, quietly, the way you repeat something you want to remember. "Mara Ashwood." He looked at her for another moment, and then he did something that no one watching had anticipated, which was to offer her his arm, formal and old-fashioned, in the gesture of a wolf escorting someone of equal standing. "Walk with me." She looked at the offered arm. She looked at his face. She took stock of everything she had and everything she didn't have, and everything that had just irrevocably changed, and she put her hand on his arm with the steadiness of a woman who had learned, in 21 years of having nothing, to hold tightly to the things that were genuinely hers. They walked, and the pack parted before them, and Elder Voss followed 3 steps behind with her white hair loose around her shoulders, and her expression the color of a storm that has finally arrived after a long forecast. They met in the Alpha King's borrowed study, a room that had been cleared for him on his arrival, and that contained, now, the particular combination of formal furniture and portable documentation that characterized his retinue's presence in any borrowed space: maps, books, a traveling desk whose surface was covered in the correspondence of running 12 packs across a territory the size of a small country. Elder Voss spread nothing on the desk. She did not need notes for what she was about to say. She had been carrying this for 40 years, since the night she had first read the complete text. The prophecy of the White Raven, she began, as it was recorded by archivist Lena Voss, my great-grandmother, in the year of the last convergence before this one, is significantly longer than the version currently included in Alpha Air Education. The version you know, Kyle, is 4 lines. The full text is 47. The difference is not incidental. Kyle sat. Mara sat across from him, and she was aware of the soul bond as a constant presence, a warm hum in her chest that she was still learning to interpret, still learning to locate in her body. She was aware of him, with the same particular awareness, as though a sense she had never had before had just opened, and he was its first object. She was also, because she was Mara, and had not suddenly become someone else, keeping her expression carefully neutral, and her posture very straight, and her mind cataloging every detail of her situation with the methodical calm of a person who has survived enough hard situations to know that panic is a resource expenditure that rarely pays its return. The 4 lines, Kale said. He was not arguing. He was giving Elder Voss the acknowledgement that she was telling him something he needed to hear. The White Raven rises when the packs are closest to catastrophe. The White Raven is the harbinger. She paused. The version you know continues, and the harbinger brings the ending. The full text says, and the harbinger brings the ending of what was corrupted. The Alpha King who raises his blade against the harbinger raises his blade against the pack's only salvation. The Alpha King who recognizes the harbinger's bond receives the key to what was stolen. She looked at them both. I have read those words every year for 40 years. I never expected to be in the room when they came true. The silence that followed was the kind that contains a great deal of rearranging. Kyle was a man who processed information thoroughly and quickly, which did not mean quickly by ordinary standards, but quickly by the standards of someone who was both a scholar and a strategist, and who had learned that rushing comprehension was a luxury only available to people whose mistakes didn't have territorial consequences. He was processing. Mara was processing differently. The way you process something that fundamentally restructures not just a situation but a self-concept, the difference between being a defect and being a design, the difference between 21 years of wrong and 21 years of, somehow, right. The corruption, Kale said finally. The text specifies what was corrupted across 11 verses, Elder Voss said. The short version is this. Approximately 300 years ago, a coalition of high-ranking elders from 4 of the 12 packs made a deliberate decision to suppress a bloodline. Not the White Raven bloodline specifically, a bloodline they called the primordial sight, which the ancient records describe as the ability to perceive the truth of a thing past its appearance, past its history, past the stories told about it by those in power. Wolves with primordial sight could not be lied to successfully. They could not be manipulated through the usual channels of pack politics. They could, in some cases, perceive the soul nature of ancient compacts, which meant they could identify when those compacts had been violated, which meant they were very dangerous to anyone who had built their power on violated compacts. She looked at Mara. The bloodline did not disappear. It was driven underground, bred into obscurity, kept in the servant classes, generation by generation, by people who knew what to suppress, and had the institutional access to suppress it. A pause. Your parents were the children of those servant lines, Mara. Both of them. Which is why what woke in you tonight is not only the raven. It is the primordial sight, at its fullest expression. The convergence was strong enough to wake what 3 centuries of suppression had only managed to muffle. Mara did not say anything immediately. She was looking at her. Hands. The rough, calloused hands of someone who had spent 21 years doing other people's work. And she was thinking about her father, who had died when she was 9, and her mother, who had followed him 2 years later, and the way they had looked at her sometimes, with an expression she had never been able to decode, something that sat between sorrow and fierce private pride. She thought she understood that expression now. She thought they had known something, or suspected something, that they had not had the words or the safety to tell her. What does it mean? She said. Her voice was even. Practically, going forward, what does it mean? Elder Voss looked at her with the particular respect of a scholar encountering the right question at the right moment. It means that every compact, every law, every territorial agreement, every piece of the governance structure of the 12 packs that has been built on a lie, and there are many, can be perceived by you for what it is. It, means that those who have built their power on those lies are now in considerable danger. And it means, she said, that the Alpha King, who is bonded to you, is either your greatest protection or the instrument of your destruction, depending on what he decides to do with what you have just told him. Cale had been very still through this. He looked at Mara now, and she looked at him, and the soul bond hummed between them with patient constancy, asking nothing, simply present, simply true. Tell me what you perceive, he said. Tell me what you see right now, in this room. This was a test. She knew it. She also knew it was a fair test, the reasonable request of a man who has just been told that everything he understood about his governing reality may have been built on deliberate falsification, who needs to know if the instrument that can verify this is real. She closed her eyes. She had no idea what she was doing, technically. The primordial sight was not a skill she had been taught. But the thing that had woken in her tonight was older than instruction and more practical than theory. And when she reached for it, it was there. She opened her eyes. You have 3 compacts in your traveling desk, she said. 2 of them are what they say they are. The 3rd is signed with a seal that was forged. The original signer has been dead for 60 years, but the compact was backdated. It concerns water rights in the Eastern Territories, and it has been used to justify taxation that has no legitimate basis. She paused. I have no idea how I know that. Elder Voss made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath. She looked at Cale. Cale looked at Mara. He stood, moved to his desk, found the compact in question in approximately 15 seconds of the particular focused searching of a man who knows his own documents, and unrolled it on the desk. He read it for a moment. He looked up. The Vethkin seal, he said. I've had questions about this one for 2 years. I could never justify the cost of a full investigation. He looked at her with an expression that was doing something complicated, something that was not quite vulnerability, because he was constitutionally unable to be fully vulnerable, but was the territory adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has been carrying a weight and has just discovered that there is, possibly, someone standing next to him who is capable of helping to hold it. What else do you see? Show me the governance rolls, Mara said. He showed her the governance rolls. They worked through the night. If you're the kind of person who has always suspected that the official story wasn't the whole story, I want you to know, you are in very good company tonight. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think Mara will find. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe, because this story is only getting deeper from here. What Mara found in the governance rolls of the 12 packs was not a single corruption or a handful of strategically placed falsehoods. It was a system. Patient, intergenerational, built over 3 centuries, with the quiet confidence of architects who believed they would never be caught, because they had already removed the only people capable of catching them. She and Cale and Elder Voss worked through, until the gray light before dawn came in through the high windows of the study. Mara calling out the documents that burned with the particular internal heat that the primordial sight used to signal falsification, Cale pulling them, reading them, cross-referencing them against his own considerable knowledge of pack governance, with an intensity that had clearly not diminished over the 11 years of his reign, but had, if anything, grown sharper and more methodical. Elder Voss took notes in the cramped, precise script of a scholar who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity for 4 decades. The picture that emerged was this: a group called, in the internal documents, that only the innermost circle ever used, the circle of the true moons, had been operating within the elder and council structures of 4 packs since before the last convergence. Their stated purpose, to those who knew of their existence, which was very few, was the preservation of traditional pack governance against what they described as the corrupting influence of new bloodlines and unorthodox power expressions. Their actual purpose, as Mara read it in the falsified compacts and rewritten histories and deliberately mistranslated ancient texts, was simpler and uglier. The maintenance of a specific power structure that benefited a specific set of families, and the systematic elimination of any power that those families could not control. The primordial bloodline had been their first and most extensive suppression project, but it had not been their only one. There were at least 3 other bloodlines documented in the ancient records that the Circle had spent generations driving. Underground, there were 6 major territorial agreements built on forged foundations. There were 2 laws, currently active and enforceable across all 12 packs, that had been written not to govern wolves, but to specifically target individuals with certain power expressions, written with deliberate ambiguity that allowed them to be applied selectively, always against the same categories of people, always by the same families. And there was the prophecy itself, the White Raven prophecy, which had not always said what the current Alpha heirs were taught it said. Mara could see this without even looking at the original, could feel in the current authorized version the places where the text had been cut, could feel the shape of the removed words the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue, a specific, particular absence that the surrounding material couldn't quite disguise. They cut the salvation verses, she said. They cut every verse that described the raven as a repair mechanism and left only the verses that described it as a threat. And then they taught those verses to every Alpha heir for 300 years. She looked at Kale. They turned the thing that could fix the system into a target that the system would automatically destroy. And because the Alpha King would be the one to destroy it, they would have no blood on their hands. The prophecy did their work for them. Kyle was quiet for a long moment. She had learned, over the hours of this working night, to read his silences with some accuracy, or at least to distinguish between them. This was not the silence of a man withholding emotion. This was the silence of a man experiencing an emotion he had not been prepared for and was processing honestly, without the usual defensive layers. "I almost killed you," he said. "If the bond had not formed, the bond forming may not have been an accident," Elder Voss said mildly. She had been saying things mildly for approximately 8 hours, and each one had landed like a stone in a quiet pool, the ripples spreading. The ancient text describes the Alpha King's bond to the Harbinger as the mechanism by which the Harbinger survives long enough to complete their function. The soul bond was not incidental to the prophecy. It was built into it, as a protection. "So my soul was not my own," Kale said. And the edge in his voice was not anger exactly, though it had the shape of anger. It was the particular quality of feeling that a person experiences when they discover that a choice they made, something they were perhaps beginning to attach significance to, was engineered before they had any say in it. Mara recognized it. She had significant experience with things being decided for her without her consent. "Your soul was exactly your own," Elder Voss said. "The bond doesn't create the soul's capacity to recognize its anchor. It simply presents the circumstances for the recognition to occur. What your soul recognized in Mara, it would have recognized whether or not a prophecy put you in the same clearing." She paused. "That is not something I can prove to you, but it is what I believe. 40 years of reading the ancient texts tells me that the soul bond, whatever its prophetic function, is not manufactured. It is found." Mara looked at Kale. She was very tired. The specific tiredness of a person who has been entirely awake for 21 years in the ways that matter, and whose body is only just now being permitted to register the cost. She was sitting across from the most powerful man in the 12 packs at a desk, covered in evidence of 3 centuries of deliberate corruption, and she was wearing a dress suitable for torch placement, and she had calluses on her hands and a white feather still caught in her hair from a transformation she had not entirely understood, and the soul bond was a warm and steady hum in her chest. And she thought, "I have never in my life been in a room where I was allowed to matter. And now I am in this room, and I do not entirely know what to do with that. I don't know what I'm supposed to do," she said, "with all of this. I don't know how you fix something this large. Kyle looked at her for a moment, and then he did something that surprised her, which was to set down the document he was holding and simply be still for a moment, the stillness of a man who is choosing to stop moving so that something else can be seen. "I don't know either," he said. "Not yet. But I know more than I did yesterday, and I know that you are the reason for that." He paused. "In my experience, knowing more than you did yesterday is usually how things that seemed impossible start to become possible. It takes more than one day, but it starts with one day." It was not a romantic declaration. It was not a promise. It was a precise and honest assessment delivered by a man who did not make promises he couldn't keep, and she recognized it as such, and she appreciated it in the exact proportion that she would have been made nervous by something larger and less earned. "All right," she said. "What do we do today?" He looked almost amused. "Today," he said, "we sleep for 3 hours, and then we go speak to your beta. He's going to be unpleasant about it." "Almost certainly. I have significant experience managing unpleasant conversations with pack betas." He looked at her with the directness of a man who is evaluating, and is not trying to hide that he is evaluating, but whose evaluation carries no cruelty. "I suspect you have significant experience managing unpleasant situations in general." 21 years, she said. "Then between the two of us," he said, "we should be adequately equipped." The conversation with Beta Cain was, as predicted, unpleasant, and also, as predicted, manageable. What made it manageable was less the specific authority of the Alpha King, though that was not irrelevant, and more the particular quality of authority that Mara had, not known she possessed until the previous night had given her access to it. The authority of someone who cannot be deceived. Beta Cain was a man who had spent 40 years managing situations through selective truth and strategic omission, and he was very good at it, and it did not work at all on Mara. She did not call him a liar in the room. She did not need to. She simply held very still when he said things that were not true, with the particular quality of stillness of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at, and after the 3rd or 4th time, he hit that stillness and watched her hold it without flinching. He ran out of things to say. The Alpha King spoke for most of the meeting, calmly and specifically, outlining the findings of the night's work in the clipped, precise language of someone who had been issuing directives for 11 years and had refined the practice to its essential elements. What he outlined was not punishment. Not yet. What he outlined was investigation, the formal, extensive, properly resourced investigation that the falsifications they had found the previous night warranted, to be conducted by a team appointed by the Alpha King's office and operating under Elder Voss's supervision. Beta Cain would cooperate fully. This was not a request. After Beta Cain left, Mara sat in the study for a moment in the new silence and thought about the ways the morning felt different from all the mornings that had preceded it. She was still, tired. She was still, in many ways, uncertain about her new form, about the scope of the primordial sight, about what happened next, about the soul bond and the man it connected her to, and what that meant in practical terms, beyond the warmth in her chest and the mutual weight of this particular morning, but the specific quality of uncertainty that she had spent 21 years living inside. The uncertainty of someone who does not know whether they have permission to take up space. That was gone. It was simply gone. She had stood in the moon's palm and transformed, and the Alpha King had tried to kill her, and the soul bond had stopped him. And then she had spent the night finding evidence of 300 years of deliberate corruption, and at the end of all that, she was sitting in a chair in a borrowed study with calluses on her hands and a feather in her hair. And she was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She understood this now with the same certainty she had once applied to the belief that she was. Kyle came back into the study from seeing Beta Cain out. He stopped when he saw her expression, which she had not had time to rearrange, and for a moment he simply looked at her with the direct, assessing attention that she had learned was his default mode of engagement with the world. Then he said, "When did you last sleep properly?" Defining properly, more than 4 hours, in a bed not on a cot, without being woken for someone else's need. She considered this. "It's been a while," she admitted. "I thought so." He moved to his desk, found the document he was looking for with his characteristic efficiency, signed his name at the bottom with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and held it out to her. "This is an order reassigning your status from domestic staff to consultant on ancient records to the Alpha King's office. It has no precedent. I am creating the precedent. It will require explanation to my council, which will be both tedious and satisfying." A slight pause. "You will have your own quarters, in whatever pact territory you choose to be based. Your own authority over your time and your work. A stipend adequate to the role." He looked at her. "This is not the sole bond. The bond doesn't require me to do this. I am doing this because you have demonstrated expertise that my office needs, and because the situation that resulted in your classification as domestic staff was built on the same falsified foundations that we spent all night documenting. Correcting it is correct, regardless of anything else." Mara took the document. She read it. Her name was in it, spelled correctly, Mara Ashwood, consultant on ancient records, a title that had never existed before this morning and that her name was the first to hold. She thought about her parents, about the look they had given her that she now understood, about 21 years of being told she was nothing in a world that had been specifically engineered to ensure she never discovered what she was. She thought about the locked door and about the thing that had blown it off its hinges the night before. "Thank you," she said, not with the automatic, grateful for permission quality that had characterized her thanks for most of her life, with the specific, personal quality of genuine acknowledgement between equals. She had never said thank you in that way before. It felt different in the mouth. It felt like something she would practice. "Don't thank me," Cale said. "Thank the great convergence. I simply made a decision the circumstances made obvious." But there was something in his voice when he said it that was not quite as detached as the words, something that she could feel in the warmth of the bond like a second conversation happening beneath the first, something that was small now, but had the quality of seeds that had been planted in very particular soil by someone who understood what they were growing and was prepared to wait. They spent 3 more days in Greyfang territory. Mara used them the way she had always used time when it was given to her, efficiently, with minimal waste. She worked through the Pact's archives with Elder Voss, documenting what could be documented, flagging for the investigation what needed flagging, building what Voss called the evidentiary architecture that the subsequent reckoning would require to be credible, structured, impossible to dismiss. She was good at this. She was, it turned out, extraordinarily good at this, in the way that people are sometimes extraordinarily good at the things they were specifically made for when they are finally given access to the materials. The primordial site did not work like magic in the sense of doing the work for her. It worked like a very fine instrument in the hands of someone who had spent 21 years developing, without knowing it, precisely the patience and precision the instrument required. She could feel the falsifications. She still had to document them. The documentation was hers. Cale moved through those 3 days as he apparently moved through most things, with the comprehensive, insomniac attention of a man who had convinced himself that there were a finite number of hours in which a finite number of problems could be addressed, and it would be a personal failure not to address all of them. She observed this from close range and found it simultaneously admirable and concerning in the way that she found most things about him, which was to say that her assessments of him were consistent and clear, and she was choosing to let them develop at the pace they warranted, rather than the pace the soul bond's warmth suggested might be possible. The bond was patient. She was patient. They would find each other at the right speed or not at all, and she suspected from everything she could read about him that he would respect the patience more than he would respect a rush. They had 2 conversations that she would remember for the rest of her life, separate from the work. The first was in the archive at midnight of the second day, when she had been working for 18 hours straight, and he had appeared with food that he had obtained himself, not sent for, obtained in person from the kitchen, which, given the Alpha King's general relationship with personal errands, struck her as significant. They ate in the archive surrounded by centuries of documents, and at some point she had told him about her parents, and he had listened without interrupting, or offering the hollow reassurances that people offer when they don't know what to do with grief. And then he had told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and whom he had never adequately mourned because the circumstances of his father's expectations had not permitted it. And they sat for a while with those two absences between them, and said nothing, and it was, somehow, exactly the right thing. The second conversation was on the morning of the 4th day, when his retinue was preparing to leave, and she was standing in the courtyard with her new documents in a bag that was newer than anything she had ever owned, a bag that a member of his retinue had produced from somewhere without explanation, and handed to her with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone following an understood direction. And he had come to say goodbye, and instead had stood next to her for a long moment, looking at the mountains, and then had said, "I don't know how to do this." She had looked at him. The bond. The work. You. I know how to run 12 packs. I know how to govern. I know how to make decisions in situations where most people would be unable to function. I do not know how to do this particular thing. He had looked at her with the expression that was his version of openness, the slight relaxation of the jaw that she had learned to read, the quality in his eyes of someone who has decided to let a thing be seen. "I thought you should know that." She had thought for a moment. "I have never in my life had anyone important to me," she had said. "My parents died before I was old enough to have made them proud of me, and after that there was no one. I don't know how to do this either." She had met his eyes. "I think that might mean we are working with equivalent disadvantages, which is at least fair." He had looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what it is." And then, because he was Cale, and therefore calibrated in everything he permitted himself, "I will see you in 3 weeks in the capital for the first council meeting of the investigation." He said it as a fact, the way you state a fact that is not yet true, but that you are committed to making true. She recognized the quality. She said yes, and he left, and she stood in the courtyard and felt the soul bond humming in her chest like a compass that had finally been given north. What came next was not simple, and it was not fast. This is true of all the things worth having, and Mara had learned patience in a school that gave no degrees and charged enormous tuition. So she was not surprised by the complexity, only by how different it felt to navigate it from inside a life that was hers, rather than one that had been assigned to her. The investigation took 11 months. Elder Voss ran it with the meticulous precision of a scholar who has waited 40 years to have the right evidence and has no intention of allowing anything procedurally compromised to undermine the outcome. The Circle of True Moons was real, and it was extensive, and when the full scope of its 3-century operation was documented and presented to the Alpha Kings Council, the resulting political upheaval was significant enough that 4 packs required transitional governance support, and 2 sets of formerly high-ranking elders found themselves in very different circumstances than they had enjoyed on the morning the investigation began. No one was executed. This was a policy decision that Cale made explicitly and publicly, on the grounds that a reckoning conducted through the same mechanisms of violence and exclusion that had built the corruption in the first place would not produce anything worth building on. This decision was controversial. It was also, Mara thought, reading in the proceedings the shape of the soul bond's influence, characteristically his. A man who had grown up believing violence was the primary instrument of governance, doing the work of believing something larger. The 3 other suppressed bloodlines were documented, and their living descendants identified. This was delicate work, the kind that required the particular combination of Mara's primordial sight and Elder Voss's archival expertise and Cale's political authority, and it took months of careful, quiet effort. But it was done. The individuals found were not, as a rule, in circumstances better than the ones Mara had come from, which was itself a form of evidence, and the process of creating paths forward for them became one of the first structural reforms of Cale's 2nd decade of rule. He built a commission. He staffed it with people whose judgment he had tested over time. He gave it resources and authority and stayed out of its day-to-day operation, which Mara thought was wisdom, and said so. And he had looked at her with that slight relaxation of the jaw, and said that she was the only person in his orbit who told him when he was doing something right, rather than cataloging his errors. And she had said that cataloging errors was also something she was available to do, and he had said he knew. And the conversation had been short, but the warmth in the bond afterward had lasted 3 days. The soul bond deepened the way the old texts described it, deepening, not in a single moment, but in accumulated ones, in 18 months of working alongside each other through the investigation, in disagreements that were genuine and productive, and that both of them found themselves approaching with the specific energy of two people who take the other's opinion seriously enough to argue with it properly. In the 2 occasions on which crises in separate territories required Mara to use the primordial sight, in circumstances that were dangerous, and in which Kale's particular combination of protective instinct and hard-won trust in her capability was tested, and, both times, navigated in a way that she felt as clarity, rather than constraint. They were not easy together in the way of people who have been shaped by their lives into easy shapes. They were honest together, and in the long run, she thought that was more valuable. He kissed her for the first time after the conclusion of the investigation's formal proceedings, in the archive room where they had first worked through the night, surrounded by the now organized evidence of 300 years of lies, which she thought was appropriate. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a considered one, the way all of his gestures were considered. The way a man who does not spend himself impulsively finally decides to spend himself, with full attention and no reservation. She received it the way she received most things that mattered, with her eyes open and her heart already halfway to wherever this was going. "You have calluses," he said, holding her hand afterward, with the tone of a man making a specific and weighted observation. 21 years, she said. "Yes." He ran his thumb across them. "I know," and in his voice was the thing that she had felt in the bond for 18 months, but had not yet heard in his words. The acknowledgement not just of what she could do, but of what she had endured. The specific, particular seeing of a person who had been thoroughly unseen, offered without pity or rescue narrative, simply as recognition. You were here. I see you. This matters. She had waited 21 years to be seen. It turned out it was worth the wait, though she would never have said that before, and did not say it now because some things are truest when they are not said aloud, when they are simply carried forward into the rest of a life. Drop a comment right now if this moment hit you the way I think it hit you, because there are some moments in a story that deserve to be marked, and this is one of them. We're almost at the end, but the end is a beginning, so stay with me. Epilogue. 5 years later. The Primordial Commission had offices now, in 4 of the 12 packed territories. Mara had not run it. She had built the framework, hired the people, designed the processes, documented the methodology, and then handed it to the 3 extraordinary individuals she had identified as better suited than her to the ongoing administrative work, a decision that Kale had questioned once, and then, watching her be proven right about all 3 of them, never questioned again. She was not an administrator by nature. She was a finder, a seer, the specific kind of person who is most valuable at the beginning and middle of things, who locates what needs to be located and then steps back to let people who are built for maintenance take over. Understanding this about herself had been one of the gifts of the last 5 years. There had been several. She was in the capital now, in the quarters that had been hers for 4 years, which were not the modest quarters of a consultant any longer, but the chambers connected to the Alpha King's suite by a door that was never locked, and that neither of them had ever discussed locking, because some arrangements make themselves without the need for formal inventory. She was working at her desk, which was covered in documents in the way that all her desks were covered in documents, and the particular document she was reading was from Elder Voss, who was 78 now, and correspondingly more direct than she had been 5 years ago, which, given Elder Voss's baseline directness, was remarkable. The document concerned 3 packs in the far eastern territories, where primordial site descendants had been identified, and where the local governance structures required evaluation, and Elder Voss had attached a note in her cramped, precise script that said only, "I think this is your work, not the Commission's." I think you know why. Mara did know why. There was a pattern in the Eastern Territories that smelled, to the primordial site, like a system rather than isolated corruption, like the work of an organized intelligence rather than opportunistic individual bad actors. She had been watching it for 6 months and had not said anything because she was doing what she had learned to do, which was accumulate enough certainty before speaking that the speaking would be useful rather than merely anxious. She was almost there. The door between the chambers opened and Kale came through it with the particular quality of motion that had not changed in 5 years. The deliberate, contained force of it. The way he occupied space without sprawling, without apology, without the performative ease of men who are uncertain of their welcome. He was 34 now. The 11 years of ruling had settled into him differently than they had sat on him before. Less armoring, more integrated, a weight that he had learned to wear rather than carry. She thought it looked like himself. She thought it had always been going toward this. Elder Voss, she said, holding up the document. He looked at it. Eastern Territories. There's a pattern. There's always a pattern. He moved to stand behind her and read the document over her shoulder, which was a habit they had developed that she found she liked. The particular quality of his attention as a presence at her back rather than across a desk. How long have you been watching this? 6 months. You didn't tell me. I was waiting until I knew what I was looking at. He made the sound that was his version of acknowledgement combined with mild protest at being kept waiting. She knew this sound. She had a small catalog of his sounds. What do you know? Enough, she said. I think it's a new formation. Not the circle. Something that came after. Something that grew in the gaps the investigation left. She turned to look at him. I think it's younger. I think it's less patient than the circle was. I think that makes it more dangerous in the short term, and more vulnerable to exposure in the long term. She met his eyes. I want to go. I know you want to go. He held her gaze for a moment. I'll come with you. You have council sessions for the next 2 weeks. Iridian can run the council sessions. She's been ready to run council sessions for a year. And I keep being there, which is preventing her development. A slight pause. I will not argue myself into staying behind. Tell me what you need. This was what 5 years had made. 2 people who had started with equivalent disadvantages and had built, through the sustained, imperfect, honest labor of it, something that was neither of their previous lives and was, somehow, better than either of them had known to want. She had not expected to be loved by a man like this. She had not expected to be anything, in the end. The thing that bloomed in the unlocked space of her chest now had no name that she had found yet in the ancient texts, though she was looking. It was not simply the soul bond, though the bond was part of it. It was something she thought, perhaps did not have a name yet, because it required the specific combination of her and him, the archivist and the king, the woman who could see truth and the man who had chosen to do something useful with it. 2 people standing in the ruins of 3 centuries of lies and choosing, every day, to build something true instead. I need 3 days to prepare the documentation, she said, and I need you to tell Elder Voss we're coming, because she will absolutely want to be involved, and it will be significantly less complicated if she feels consulted from the beginning. He made the sound again. She always wants to be involved. She is always right about when to be involved, Mara pointed out. Yes, he said, which is one of the most inconvenient truths about Elder Voss. He bent and pressed a brief, specific kiss to the top of her head, the gesture of a man who has learned over 5 years that the small gestures matter more than the large ones, that it is in the ordinary moments and not the extraordinary that a person shows what they have chosen. 3 days, he said. Then we go find your pattern. She turned back to her desk. The morning light came in through the high windows of the Capitol chambers and landed on the documents and on her hands, which still had calluses. And she thought that they always would, that they were hers in the way that everything she had endured was hers. Not despite her life, but including it. Every cold morning and overlooked meal and year of wanting what she couldn't have, all of it leading here, to this desk, to this morning, to the work that was not yet finished, and the man who was not going anywhere, and the door between the chambers that was never locked. She was found. She was seen. She was at last, in the world that had always been hers, working on the problem that had always been hers to solve. The white raven flew when the moon called, and every time she came back, she brought with her a little more truth, and the world was a little more whole. If this story found you at the right moment, you know it. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of Mara's journey stayed with you, because every story is completed by the person who receives it, and I want to know what you found here. If this is your first time with us, subscribe right now, because there are more stories where this one came from. Stories about women who were told they were nothing, and about the worlds that discovered, too late, how wrong they were. Hit the like button if Mara and Kale gave you what you came here for. And I'll see you in the next story, where the moon has another secret to tell.